So that cone slides out of there and slides in here, and then what's nice is with this, when you go through and you hand crank it, right up here, you'll see that there are little dots that light up for the RPMs, and it's only by every 500, but at least if you have some idea that right now we're using 1,000 RPMs, as you hand crank, you can at least get in the ballpark of it, because it is also like when you hand ventilate patients and you're stressed out, and all of a sudden you realize that your knuckles are white and you can't hold the influ bag any longer because your hands are tired and you're hand ventilating your patient at 60 breaths per minute, and you don't really need that. Sacrit comes up right there. Any questions on those things so far? All right, you guys are vaguely awake, that's good. Okay, oxygenator. So with the oxygenator, this to me is one of the trickiest parts of the whole system. It's fine that it chafes cords all around, but really understanding what's happening with the oxygenator is key to understanding what's happening with your ECMO circuit. So what I have here, so because I'm now old and I can't not show things that used to be when I was a child, this is the way oxygenators used to look, and this is the oxygenator that you'll find in 99% of the ECMO part. There's one program not using the Quadrox, right? The last time we queried about this. I mean, so basically all of the United States is using the oxygenator that we're using here. We're hoping that there will be some new oxygenators introduced because this makes us totally dependent on the manufacturer, which we've had issues with. But the good news for you is it will seem very familiar. The reason partly that I show you this is not only because this is what I did when I was a child, but to point out that what we have evolved over time in oxygenators, this is exponentially a better oxygenator than the old one. The old one was fraught with issues, and since we have the new one, it has made life much easier. So the way that the oxygenator works is that you have a counter current of blood and gas running opposed to one another, and then you have diffusion that occurs across pores within your circuit. And when you look at, this is the old, when I was a child, surface, and then here's the surface area of the new ones. So you can see the old one had much larger holes within it. So what this meant is that the oxygenators would basically develop pulmonary edema, like all of us develop pulmonary edema, as you already have large holes and you lose the integrity of those pores, they can start to froth out. And so what should be the gas exchange part of the oxygenator would start to have serous fluid coming out of it. Whereas our new circuits, there's much less porosity. You still have you have better diffusion across them, but they also tend to froth out the way the old ones do. So part of the reason why the Quadrox is complicated is because it actually has 3 different things moving through it, and it's doing 2 jobs for you. So one job that it's doing is it's acting like the lung, just as in us. So if it's acting as the lung, then that means it has to have blood flow through it. So the way that the Quadrox functions is that it's set up as a diamond. So this is the oxygenator here on the circuit. And so you've got, here's your pump. So you've got your patient back here, blood is coming, pump's got to drive everything. So the pump is the real first physical part of the circuit. And then once you go from the pump, you go to the oxygenator. So again, you can think about this, the way I think about it is, I try to make all of this be as close to reality or as close to what I normally know to have it make sense. So in this case, you have your pump head, you have your oxygenator after it, just like you have your right ventricle sending blood into your lungs. And what's important about that is that this can act as a filter the same as your lung acts as a filter in your body to minimize some of the emboli that are happening from the venous linear circuit and from those microthrombi that we talk about forming in the pump head. But so blood comes in here and runs across the face. So you can see in this picture what ends up happening is that if blood comes in at the bottom, or at the bottom here, it then diffuses up the face of that whole oxygenator and then moves across until it comes to the backside and then diffuses down the backside and comes out the tubing on the back end of it. And this is why it's confusing, is because what you have is 3 different things going through it. So if you've got blood flow going front to back through it, you have to have gas flow that's running in countercurrent. And so the way the gas flow actually runs through this thing is from the top to the bottom. So if you look at your oxygenator and you see this, so you see blood running in and out here, and then here's a tube running in, and if you follow this tube back, and it comes around here, you get to a flow meter like you guys are used to seeing for nasal cannula with a blender associated with it. So this is your gas source in. So gas source in at the top. If it goes in at the top, it must therefore come down and out the bottom. Down here at the bottom, it's confusing because there's this one piece right here that's just a stand. This is actually the exhalation port of the oxygenator. You can remember either one of them. Usually you know that this one's the exhalation port, because just like you have condensation when we breathe out, there can be condensation when this breathes out as well. So if you touch the exhalation port of this, you'll realize that it's a little damp when you touch it. And there's no tubing, it's just open like that. And then, so you've got blood front to back, gas top to bottom, and the other job that this does for us is this acts as a heater. You can imagine if you have all this blood sitting outside a patient. So this circuit that you're looking at is our adult circuit, and the adult circuit, how much? 400? So this is about 400 cc's. Our smaller circuit that we use on kids who are less than 15 kilos, it has 250
250 to 300.
or so in it. So you can imagine that when we have our little 3-kilo babies whose circulating blood volume is 250 to 300, and then you've got 250 sitting out here, here's their whole blood volume. So hello, freezing child patient, unintentionally freezing child patient. So then this is what acts as your heater. And this is not connected in the moment. This is actually the heater. What is in here is water. And so water is heated, and then it runs through 2 huge cannula that will look like nothing else that you've seen, so it'll be obvious when it's connected. And so then you have hot water go on one side, and then the water come back out the other side, and then it goes back and circulates to the heater. And then they set the temperature on the heater. So again, one thing to start thinking about then is you're thinking about management of your patient on ECMO. How well do you think your patient is going to auto-regulate their temperature if they're on ECMO? Not very well, right? And so the ability of your patient to generate a fever when they're on ECMO is really minimized, especially for the neonates. They can't do it, so you have to be thinking about infection in every other way.
If you have to add a component to the circuit, such as like CRRT or something to it, do you do it after the oxygenator or before?
We try and do most everything before the
Okay, so
oxygenator.
that it's heated before it goes back to the patient. Doesn't
And-
have nothing-
Yeah, heated, and more importantly, so that it can act as the filter. Because when I say act as the filter, so this is what that oxygenator looks like if you cut it from the top of the diamond down. So these are all the microtubules that are running through it. And so the blood is flowing across these microtubules. And then some of the microtubules have water running through them, and some of them have gas running through them. I forget which side is which in this picture, but you can see how many of them there are in there. And so there's a face plate here, there's also a plate here, and then a back plate here, and so it compresses all those together, because the more surface area of contact you have between the gas and the blood, the more capacity you have for oxygen delivery. Flow, contact time, oxygen. So as much as there's a blender on there, I can't say that to you enough. If you're trying to oxygenate your patient, it's flow, it's surface area, it's contact time, it's all that much more so than it's just simply dialing up the FiO2 on there. The same way as when you're on a ventilator, yes, you can dial your FiO2 around to some degree, but if you're really trying to change oxygenation in your patient, you're changing your mean airway pressure. For us here, mean airway pressure is flow.
Is there a max flow that can go through the oxygenator, or it's, can you handle anything you put in
No,
the
you have max flows, and so the oxygenator that you see there, that white one, is our adult oxygenator. Most of the time, you guys are gonna see the smaller version of that, which is dark blue, but also still looks like a diamond sitting there. The max flow through the pediatric one, do you know what it is officially, Kim?
5.
No, the
No.
pediatric one. Is it, do they officially say 2.5 for the pediatric one?
No, it's higher on that one.
Is it really 5?
Yeah, yeah. It is higher.
didn't think it was as high as 5. We'll look it up and we'll get back to you, because it'll come up in one of the other talks. Oh, hi.
Hi. Can I just pop in and say hi and welcome to all of you to take this amazing course with amazing faculty, and I want to make sure that you have a lunch break?
Yeah,
New faculty,
yes.
Alex and
Alex.
for critical care, and I guess there's some neonatology faculty also. We go to the Savon Courtyard for lunch, and there's a welcome to new faculty, and we get to introduce you officially. So,
That's
Anyway.
new.
That's what we're doing. And Rachel signed out, so I told Alex she could have her escort over.
okay. All right, so it's your turn to watch. Okay. All right, good luck. Have
I don't know,
fun.
maybe Alex's turn to watch Rachel, maybe what's actually happening.
You know, the line from, what's the movie with Dory? Not Finding Dory, the first one.
Finding
Finding
Nemo.
Finding Nemo.
Just keep swimming,
Mhm.
just keep spinning.
Get out.
2.8 on the blue.
I just got
That's,
that.
yeah, that's what I thought. So the pediatric oxygenator is rated to flow at 2.8 liters, but we use 15 kilos as our cut point between when we switch from our neonatal circuit up to our adult circuit, because we want to leave some more forgiveness in the system than that.
I was thinking sweet 5.7, that's what it was.
What did you say the oxygen max was? I didn't hear you.
2.8, but we really switch around 15 kilos.
Where's the temperature? Which screen is the temperature?
Temperature doesn't show, so the temperature gets set on the heater down here, and there's back here, a little digital, which will tell you what it's set for, but your patient's temperature.
Your patient,
Yeah,
so if there is, and is there like a standard temperature that you guys set here?
Mhm.
What
Yeah,
is it?
that's a good question. What's the standard temperature that we usually set, Kim? 36?
It'll vary a little bit, somewhere between 36, sometimes up to 38, depending on our bipolar air conditioning in our rooms.
And if we're cooling, we set it a little bit lower.
Right.
And we set it at 35.
How much heat do they usually lose from the membrane to the patient, from your experience? I mean, if it's set at 36 here, what is the patient actually temperature usually?
36 and a half, 37. So if we're running normothermia, because I was actually going to point that out for hypothermia, that if you're running hypothermia, this is amazing to have in your world. But so if we're running normothermic, if that's set somewhere between 36 and 37 or as high as 38, then your patient's temperature is going to be normothermic. That's why you can't rely on it to tell you whether your patient has a fever or not. So I can't tell you exactly how much is lost. I can just tell you that the goal is to keep the patient within whatever temperature range that you want that patient in. So in the NICU, they run more hypothermia protocols than we do in the pediatric ICU, and certainly than in the cardiac ICU. And so for you, when you guys are running your hypothermia protocol, what do you usually run them at?
So we run the heater at 35, but then we still keep them on the cooling bucket to get them to 33 and a half.
So, how come you don't turn the heater down further?
You can do either way. Places do either way.
Because that's the way we do it here.
Because that's the way we do it here.
Which
Well,
is-
the heater's on manual, and if we use the blanket,
The
the
blanket's
rectal probe,
servo-regulated
then
to
it's
the probe.
servo-regulated to the
Yeah.
probe.
Oh,
So
that's
then we
right,
don't have to
that's
play
right.
with the,
So you get them partway there. with the
I've been
heat.
places where we've done both though,
What's the
or
life-
one or the other.
What's the life expectancy of the software?
So the Quadrex is really variable, I would say, in terms of its life expectancy. It's only rated for 6 hours, as I said, as with everything else on the circuit. And we'll get anywhere from a couple of days to a couple of weeks out of an oxygenator. Would you say that's fair? Just, it's interesting how dynamic it is, and it really, and the question also about it is how does it fail? Let me just
Does it
finish.
have anticoagulant properties like the tubing does?
Yeah, so this is not heparin bonded, but, no, it is heparin bonded, it's the
I
other,
don't think the Quadrox is.
yes, it is. It's the Sorin stuff that has the amyphospholates.
The,
But the, yes, the
Soft line or
oxygenator
Bioline?
is heparin bonded also. We'll come back to the failing oxygenator in 2 seconds. I just want to see if there are other slides in here that I want to show you. Oh, here's where we were talking about the uniform blood thickness, 30%. 6 hours. Oh, this is a picture when we were talking about when I was a child, the oxygenator. This is all pulmonary edema frothing out into a pool. You would routinely walk in and there would be a diaper around the bottom of the oxygenator. You don't have that anymore.
Can I ask a question about the tubing? So what is the advantage of having, like, the actual distance between, for instance, like the pump and the oxygenator is actually like only a few inches, but you have all like 5 feet of tubing instead of like a short tubing between them? What's the advantage to having all that additional tubing?
I was just thinking about where I was gonna build that in. Let me finish talking about the oxygenator for a second, and then we'll go to the tubing, because otherwise I'll forget. So this relates to Alex's question about how long an oxygenator lasts. So part of the question is how long does the oxygenator last? Part of the question is how long do our circuits in general last, because they are different things. Within the ECMO manual of operations, some feature number 50, one of the things that's in there are guidelines to changing the circuit or changing components of the circuit. And what the guidelines, the way that they're written is they tell you some of the reasons why a piece may be failing, or some of the signs that a piece is failing, and then the risks associated with changing that piece or the whole circuit out to help you come together to make a decision about whether you're changing one piece of the system or whether you're changing the whole thing. So for example, if this is full of all those tiny microtubules, then you can easily start developing clot within here. And then the question is how does that clot impact your life? Does that clot impact your life because it's creating so much hemolysis and it's creating DIC, in which case you probably have more than just clot within your oxygenator, it's within your whole system. Or is the clot just affecting the functionality of the oxygenator? So there are 2 ways that you can tell how your oxygenator is functioning. So one is if it's doing the job of your lungs, then if it's failing, what would you expect to see?
Decrease oxygen, decrease CO2.
Right, so how would you know that? If you had to design a way to check and see, is this thing getting rid of CO2 as
Yep.
efficiently as I think and getting oxygen?
Plus, those gas?
Right, so with blood gases, right? So what you want is you want a blood gas that comes in before the oxygenator, and then you want an blood gas that comes after the oxygenator so that you can compare the 2. But in making those comparisons, you have to understand how this is actually working. So how this is working when it comes to ventilation is what we call the sweep speed. So CO2 diffuses very rapidly. And so if CO2 diffuses very rapidly, when we talk about how this has gas passing through it, then the way that ventilation happens is how fast you have the sweep speed or how fast you have this flow meter turned up. So a rough rule of thumb is that when you first start a circuit, it's about 1-to-1 with your flows. So that if you're flowing at 400 milliliters per minute, then you turn your sweep to 0.4. Wouldn't you say that's true, Kim? So that just gives you an initial starting point, and then you see what happens on your blood gases. And it's partly what's happening with your blood gas here, but it's also partially what's happening with your blood gas with the patient, because depending on how you're cannulated, this may or may not be doing the majority of the work for you. So so that tells you about ventilation. And then oxygenation, I've already started reading into you, is about flow and is about contact time within the oxygenator, but it is also somewhat about the FiO2 that you have dialed in, especially if you're looking at the health of your oxygenator. So when you're hearing your numbers on your ECMO circuit, not only do you want to hear the flow, so how much do you have going through here to oxygenate your patient, or how much cardiac output are you generating, and how many RPMs is it taking to deliver that. What you also want to know is what your sweep speed is and what your FiO2 is. So the way we have our protocols written is that there's protocols for titrating the patient's pH, and there are protocols to titrate the FiO2 to keep your post-oxygenator PaO2 greater than 250. I always forget whether it's 200 or 250. And the reason why I say that is because every 6 hours we get pre and post oxygenator gases off of the circuit. And when you're on rounds in the morning, you're going to have pre and post oxygenator gases. And one of the things that when you're in the beginning of learning, you've initially completely disregard are those pre and post oxygenator gases, because you can't figure out what they're for. What they're for is to tell you about your oxygenator. So if your oxygenator is failing from the standpoint of acting as your lung, what you're gonna hear is that when you come in the morning, you're gonna realize that your sweep speed instead of being 0.4, now today is up at 0.8, or your FiO2, which was 50 yesterday, is now 75, but your pre and post gases will probably be fairly similar. Does that make sense? So some places just set the FiO2, for example, and don't worry about titrating it, so then when you hear the post-oxygenation PaO2, you know where it's varying. For us, we titrate our FiO2 to keep the PaO2 greater than 250, so you do have to be aware of what your FiO2 was the day before, which to me is, again, just like a ventilator. When you hear blood gas in your patient, you think about what your ventilator settings are. Here, you don't have to worry about tidal volume and rate, and FiO2, all you have to worry about is sweep speed and FiO2. Make sense? So one way this can fail is because of gas exchange. I would say that's the most uncommon way these fail. We only have a few that we actually change out because you're not having as good a gas exchange. The old oxygenators, that's the way they fail. These fail more because they start to develop so much clot within them that it impedes flow through the circuit. So if you are impeding flow, increasing the resistance, you're gonna see changes in pressure, right? And so if we see changes in pressure, that must imply that we're measuring pressure within this system, especially when we're talking about flow and resistance. You should have already started thinking about, oh, where it is pressure is getting measured. So one place that we measure pressures is off of this tubing here. You can, why is this red in here? There's pressure tubing, so here's your pre-oxygenator pressure, and if you feel that when you come up to the circuit, if you feel this tubing, you'll realize that it's stiffer than all this other tubing, so you know that it's pressure monitoring, and then as you follow it back, it comes back to a transducer that you recognize from your arterial lines and your venous lines in your patients. So, and we call this pre-membrane, and then off the back of the oxygenator is the same stiff tubing that comes up to the transducer. The place that these are measured, since this has to do with the brain that's in the system, are over here on the neurosorin. And so you can see up here, you have your pre and your post-oxygenator pressures. Makes sense? So which one do you think has the higher pressure? Pre, right? And you're pushing blood through, you have high resistance within there. So typically when we first put an oxygenator in line, the difference between those two numbers is about 10. So there's a little bit of a gradient, but there's not a big gradient. The protocol to think about when to change that oxygenator is that if you get up to a delta P of 75 across there, or if you have one that's starting to rapidly rise, that would be the indication to change the oxygenator, not necessarily change the entire circuit. 75 or rapidly rising. It's in the manual.
Probably you said that, but this sweep speed, where does it measure?
There's a flow meter right here.
And where does it measure? In the system?
Here, it doesn't, it's just off the flow meter. You can see what the flow meter is set at, and just like you can see the FiO2. So it's just like a nasal cannula.
Where are you adjusting your sweep?
Okay. This is the simplest part of the entire setup.
This is a marker for blood pressure.
This is a marker of what does it do? So it's remembering that your sweep speed is the speed with which the gas is passing in counter current to your blood, and CO2 diffuses rapidly. So the higher your sweep speed, the more ventilation you have. So you have a patient whose blood gas comes back and they're 73250, and their sweep speed is set at 0.4. Then you're going to turn your sweep speed up to 0.5 or 0.6. There's actually calculations that we built for the ECMO specialists to be able to decide how much to change their sweep speed in either direction to titrate for the pH.
When you said it started at 1.1, you were, and you used the number 400 arbitrarily, that was a mLs per minute,
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess.
So the nursing control both the sweep speed and the FiO2 with the increased oxygenation.
Say that again?
We can control both the FiO2 and sweep speed in order to control oxygenation.
So sweep speed is ventilation. That's all sweep does for you, is ventilate. FiO2 tells you how much oxygen is being put into here, but if you really want to affect your patient's oxygenation, which Rachel is going to talk about at length,
We're gonna hear all this again.
but you can't hear enough
gory
because
detail.
you forget it. It's really hard to remember, actually. The flow that I'm talking about with oxygenation is the blood flow. Because CO2 diffuses more slowly, so you need more contact time between the oxygen and the blood. And so lots of contact areas, so that's why all the microtubing is within the oxygenator, and then more flow through there, more blood in contact with the FiO2 in order to increase your patient's saturation. Does that make sense?
Those two different ways that the oxygenator would fail, it's usually happening at the same time. So you will, even if you have a lot of clot in the oxygenator, it may still exchange gas while.
Right. That's what I was saying, with the old oxygenator, we used to pay really close attention to the pre and post gases, because those would be the things that we would change the old oxygenators, either because your pre and post is changing, so that you realize you come in one day and your PaO2 in your post oxygenator is now 240 and you're on 90% through the blender, and then you come in the next day and you hear that your post oxygenator PaO2 is 180 or 200 and you're on 100% through the blender. So now we know that oxygenator is on its way out. So the old oxygenators, we would see that a lot, and or you would just walk in and realize they're changing the diaper on the oxygenator so much that you're losing huge volume from your patient, and so then we would change those oxygenators. This is why I think people forget about what the pre and post gases are really for, because the majority of the time when you hear those numbers, they're not gonna be that different day to day. You're gonna walk in and you're gonna realize that your patient's sweet, so in our little neonates that we're running at, say, flows of 300 milliliters per minute or 400 milliliters per minute, it is not uncommon that their sweep speed is down around 0.1 liters per minute, and even with that, their PaCO2 is lower than you want it to be. And so it'll be 0.1, it'll be 0.1, it'll be 0.1 for days on end, and then maybe it'll be 0.2, and the FiO2 will be 55 or 60%, and it just kind of rides that way. It's very uncommon, I think. The only ones that I can remember changing here because the oxygenator was really failing in terms of gas exchange is actually on our big kids. Do you think that's true? And our really big kids that we changed these some because the oxygenator has failed in terms of gas exchange?
Yeah, I can recall. I think there's only been like one.
Unit?
I don't think we've ever, a unit, I don't,
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we did one.
one.
It was
In the PICU.
chili curry, I think.
Oh.
Not change, so it's very uncommon to see it, it's really more about that change in pressure that you see. And again, once this starts to clot off, it's less that we're changing it because you get to the absolute number of 75, but instead what you'll see is that transmembrane gradient that was 10, 15, 12, 15, 15, 16 is then 22, and then it's 25, and then it's 30, and then it's 35, and instead of first hearing those initial variances day to day, now every time you go in the room, your ECMO specialist is telling you that the transmembrane gradient is going up. So people either call the transmembrane gradient, call the delta T, the transmembrane pressure, all of that. The only change in pressure that people talk about in the ECMO circuit is the change in pressure across the oxygenator. The only other pressure we monitor on the circuit is the venous pressure, because you can imagine that, you guys don't have to imagine, you already told me that you recognize that the pressures coming off of the venous limb here are all positive pressures. So then you also want to know how this pump is interacting with your patient in terms of how negative a pressure you're generating. And so you have a venous pressure that's monitored off the limb here, so that's what this connector is. And again, you can feel the stiff tubing, and that is going back to the transducer here. And so when you look up here, and it says venous pressure, that's what that venous pressure is. So that's why that's a negative number, and then the others are all positive numbers. Make sense? So questions about the oxygenator? So going to Wendy's question, and actually Ken's question about where we put these things in line. So you can see that there are lots of stopcocks within this system, right? So why are all the stopcocks there? Well, the stopcocks are partly there because we've talked about things like that you're measuring pressures that you actually have to have. So and then the other reason why stopcocks exist is that especially in the neonates, they don't have much access for them. And so then the circuit ends up becoming an important access point for them. And so people have TPN running through this, on occasion they'll have inotrope running through it, you put blood products through here, so you have to have ways to get that to your patient. So that's what many of the stop cogs are for, or if you're gonna connect CVVH to it, and we'll have a whole talk on renal replacement therapy on ECMO. But then you have to be able to connect your CVVH circuit in here. But as you start thinking about those things, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, we talked about hemolysis, and hemolysis being related to thrombus formation. And thrombus formation happens when you don't have laminar flow. So every time you have a change in tubing diameter, or more importantly, when you change the compliance of the tubing, so all of this is pretty soft and flexible, you can tell, right? But stopcocks are hard plastic. So every time we put a connector within our circuit here, if you look and see, this is where thrombus formation starts to happen. So you're trying to play the balance between putting enough things in line that you can actually do the patient care that you need to do for the majority of your patients, and not having extra things in there that you don't need to have because it increases that turbulence and the propensity for hemolysis. So one of the things that we believe is that because this is so confusing for everybody, it's better to have a standard circuit so that our circuit always looks the same no matter what patient is on it, no matter what unit they're in. And so all of our circuits are built the same, and that's why you see all these stopcock adapters in here. If you go to the CTICU, where we pretty much always, and not pretty much, we do always have a central line outside of this. We rarely are using these stopcocks, but if you go to the NICU or even pretty frequently in the PICU, you'll realize that a bunch of these are being used to infuse medications because they don't have as much access in those patients. Now the question is what's the difference between here and here, and why are there A-fields where they are right here? So why do you guys think that all of the connectors that we put in to infuse into the circuit, or the majority, are put between the pump and the oxygenator?
I guess you already mentioned the oxygenator acts as a filter.
Right. So number one is that this is going directly into your patient, or the circuit is going directly into your patient at some point in time. So if you're infusing into your circuit, if you have a choice, wouldn't you rather infuse into your oxygenator where it's going to catch either the thrombi or the air that you're infusing, so that you don't directly cause an embolus for your patient, which we do frequently anyway. So that's one.
And your
And
pump
then,
is heat, creates heat to affect the medications.
what creates heat?
The pump.
Oh, but it's not so hot or so cold that it changes the medications necessarily any differently than your patient's own body temperature does. And the water is not in contact with the blood, it's separated by a membrane. So the other important feature about why they're all here, again, has to do with safety. So you guys talked about the fact, what's the pressure here?
Plus,
Positive, what's the pressure here?
negative.
Negative. So now if I'm connecting a stopcock, or I'm connecting a medication up here, and I turn my stopcock the wrong way, what happens?
Air balloon.
You suck air into your circuit, and if you suck enough air in, you can either lock your pump so that your pump stops working, or you can suck enough air into your oxygenator that you preclude flow through the whole thing. And we'll talk about the air in this in just a second. Whereas here, if I turn a stopcock the wrong way, what happens? Right.
Bleed on
The other
yourself.
people are gonna get super pissed off at you because you spray them with blood, but better you spray them with blood than that you suck a bunch of air into your circuit. So that's why those things exist here. And yes, there are some stopcocks on the backside of the oxygenator, but we really try and not infuse through those so that you're not putting your patient at risk of having a clot phenomenon. The one thing we traditionally have been putting through here is the platelets, although Kim is working on changing that, so either of those we give pre-oxygen.
Why do we do those posts at this moment?
Because there's been theories that have gone back and forth that if you give them pre-oxygenator, do they predispose the oxygenator clot? Because basically the oxygenator just takes up all of the platelets was the thought process. I'm just trying to figure out whether there's new information out there to say that that's not true, especially with.
A lot of that was based on the old oxygen system.
Yeah, right. Right, so, we may be moving there. So the things that I would encourage you to think about, so even though we have all these points of access in here, is that when you're using them, always think about the pros and cons of what you're doing. And And so, for example, when I look at this, if I'm thinking about infusing blood products into my circuit, or if I'm thinking about giving blood products to my patient, I'm trying to preserve the health and the life of this so that I don't have to change it out and expose my patient to all this plasticizer and inflammatory response again if I don't have to, plus all the blood that's within the circuit. So then as you're giving things, if you're giving things that may make something clot, is the best place to give that into your oxygenator. So for me, for example, platelets and cryoprecipitate are the two that have the biggest propensity to clot things up. So if you have a PID in your patient and you have an ECMO circuit, I would give the platelets and the cryo to the PID and minimize what's being given to the circuit. So that's one way to think about it. The other thing to think about is that as you're giving continuous infusions to your patient, you're making choices about where that's going in. Your oxygenator is an excellent infusion point because you'll never have bigger lines to push through in your life than what you have here. So for example, when we talk about the cannula sizes, in the neonates, usually the smallest arterial cannula that we put in is an 8 to 10 French arterial cannula. Nobody in here has pushed through an 8 to 10 French line in a neonate ever in their lives. So you can get blood or whatever into your patient very quickly. But that's only working if your circuit is working. And so the thing to remember for all these continuous infusions that you're giving into your circuit is that if you have any problems with your circuit and your circuit goes down, then you're not getting those infusions. So that's why the CTXU always has lines in place, and if we're giving our patients inotropes, those inotropes are going through their lines, not going through the circuit, so that if the circuit goes down, we already have those going to the patient, and you don't have to, in the moment of troubleshooting everything else, also have to panic about that.
Laura, you're talking about like the pluses and minuses of injecting and hooking groups up to before the pump and after the pump. Do we kind of have a standard here, like if you start a drip without saying where it's gonna be hooked up to, or you request a bolus of whatever without saying where they're gonna bolus to, where our techs typically bolus and where our techs typically hook up drips?
All the specialists will use